Good morning. I've put together a little slideshow called It Was the Best of Times, It Was the Worst of Times. And it's basically talking about the astrology of the period from 2020 through 2044. And I've broken it up into four parts. So the first part goes over some of the significant things that have happened in the years 2020, 2021, and 2022. The second part will talk about the astrological causes behind the current war in the Middle East between Israel and Hamas. And it will also begin talking about the April 8th, 2024 solar eclipse and talking about people who have been wounded, people and countries who have been wounded in some respect by that eclipse. And part three will continue with that list of wounded warriors out there, if you will. And then part four will begin with America's presidential election, talk a bit about that, and about what to expect in the years to come, all the way up through up until 2044. So let me see if I can share my slideshow and we can begin. This will take just a second. Okay, and I have to get rid of a few panels that I see so that I can see everything that I'm trying to do here. And let me enlarge this. All right, and now I think we're ready to begin. It was the best of times, it was the worst of times, 2020 through 2044. And I have a list here of a bunch of things that I'll be talking about. I may talk about a few additional things I don't have on this list. But you can pause if you want and just take a look at this list and then continue. Okay, so this is going to be part one. And the first thing I want to mention, some of these things I've talked about in previous videos, but I want to repeat them here again. The first thing I'll mention is the Barbo Planetary Cycle Index. Now what this is, it's a cumulative sum of the distances between the outer planets, Jupiter, Saturn, Uranus, Neptune, and Pluto. And when that cumulative sum is low, that means that the planets are all bunched together, and that creates an imbalance. And when the index is high, that means the planets are further apart, everything's more in balance, energy flows from one to the other, and things are better. Well, at the start of 2020, we hit this point where we were going into this trough, which represents the low for the entire century. And in March of 2022, we hit the absolute low for the Barbo Planetary Cycle Index. And we'll talk about that in just a bit. But these years from 2020 through March of 2022, this just the Barbo Planetary Cycle Index by itself uh, promises that these could be very trying years. And actually, 10 years before it happened, the late great mundane astrologer Andre Barbeau, he predicted that a pandemic might start in the year 2020. Okay, let's move on, see what we have next. Well, shortly after the start of the year 2020, we had a very strong lunar eclipse on January 10th. And this eclipse was powerful because Saturn and Pluto were almost exactly conjunct, and they were conjunct the sun and opposite the moon. This, along with the low value for the Barbo Planetary Cycle Index, This was a strong indication that we might experience a pandemic around this time. And sure enough, this was the year of COVID. Now, the pandemic didn't really take off until March of 2020, when the number of cases just began to grow exponentially. But the virus was getting out of China at the beginning of 2020, earlier than people expected. And in fact, 2 days later, Saturn and Pluto were exactly conjunct. And on this day, January 12th, 2020, my wife and I were in London and we both contracted COVID. And it was rather scary. Fortunately, I had a very mild case, but my wife almost died. And no one was expecting the virus to be loose outside of China at that time. So there weren't any real diagnostic tests out there, certainly not home tests you could use to see if you had COVID or not. And it really wasn't on the radar of most medical professionals at this point. So we just called it a strange flu. Uh, we kept expecting it to get better for my wife any day, but it just kept lingering on and on. We went to a doctor, and the doctor gave my wife some antibiotics, which helped a little bit, but not that much. And she did not really start to improve significantly until after a couple of weeks when we got back to the United States. So uh, this was certainly a difficult time for us. This is when the virus really was beginning to spread in other countries outside of China. But as I said, it wasn't on the radar of most medical professionals at this time. And diagnostic tests were either scarce or non existent at this point. Okay, let's see. Oh, also, it's about a 30-year cycle here. Pluto and Saturn are in Capricorn. So, one of the things you expect in this roughly 30-year cycle between conjunctions is that there are going to be a lot of transformations in the structure of power in the world. And this really picks up steam once Pluto moves into Aquarius and power begins to transfer from individuals to the people. Now, out of curiosity, I took a look at the transits on this day, January 12th, to Vladimir Putin. I looked at his chart. I always feel I should point out there is some dispute over Putin's birth data, but this is the chart that most people use, set up for October 7th, 1952, 9:30 a.m. in St. Petersburg in Russia. And I've seen this chart work quite well. Of course, one of the problems with looking at Putin's chart is that Russia is not really an open society. Information tends to be controlled and concealed. So we can see things that might be affecting Russia or Putin astrologically, but we don't always hear about it in the news. Nonetheless, in this chart, Saturn and Pluto are in Putin's third house, which has to do with communication, the mind. It's making a pretty strong square to his natal Mercury over here in Libra. And this might be where the time when Putin first got the idea to eventually invade Ukraine and probably ultimately invade other countries too in order to try and restore the old Soviet empire. Okay, this is going to be restriction and transformation, power of an individual, since this is in Capricorn, uh, affecting his thought process, his left brain, uh, thoughts and activity. All right, let's move on to the next slide. Toward the end of 2020, we had another momentous conjunction, and that was Jupiter conjunct Saturn. Now, these two planets come into conjunction about once every 20 years, but this conjunction was more important because it represented a shift of these conjunctions occurring in earth signs to now occurring in air signs. The conjunctions had been occurring in earth signs for about 200 years, and that puts more of an emphasis on material goods, capitalism, um, resources, getting as much as you can. But with this conjunction between Jupiter and Saturn, now set to occur in air signs for about the next 200 years, this is going to put more emphasis on creativity and technology, which is Aquarius, abstract thought, which is Gemini, and relationships with others, which is Libra. With this conjunction occurring in Aquarius over the next 20 years, we see also more emphasis on humanitarian concerns and on collective power rather than individual power. This is going to all be strengthened when Pluto moves into Aquarius, and we see that transfer of power from individuals to the people. Now, the fact that this occurred also on the day of the winter solstice, that just adds extra emphasis to this particular Jupiter-Saturn conjunction. So anyway, this particular conjunction, it's important because it occurs in Aquarius, where Pluto will soon be, and that represents big changes in technology and uh, in terms, too, of who has the power, moving from individuals to people. And it also, for the next 200 years, we have this conjunction occurring in air signs. So abstract ideas, creativity, relationships, they're going to take precedence over materiality, uh, concern about material goods and unending wealth and capitalism and stuff like that. Okay, now let's move on from 2020 into 2021. And of course, the big event for America on that day was the January 6th insurrection. Now, in looking at America, I tend to have a preference for a July 2nd, 1776 chart, because that is the day that the Continental Congress passed the Resolution for Independence. July 4th was the day it was printed and distributed to the public. And if you want to use a July 4th chart, that's fine. Most of what I say here in reference to the July 2nd chart also applies to July 4th or other July 1776 charts. It's only the moon that's going to have moved quite a bit over a couple of days. Now, I should also mention that, in my opinion, the creation of America, it was not a single event, it was a series of pivotal moments that brought America into being. As a result, there are several charts which can be used to try and understand the future of America. The Sibley July 4th chart is one of them that works quite well. It's simply that I think that the July 2nd chart for the passage of the resolution for independence often works just slightly better than the Sibley chart. Again, most of what I say here, except when the moon is involved, it's going to apply to all of these July 1776 charts for America. So, on the day of this insurrection, uh, in the nation's capital, we had transiting Uranus making a very strong square to the lunar nodal axis. Uranus is all about breaking up the existing pattern. At best, that is wonderful creativity. At worst, it's destructive revolution. And the lunar nodal axis, it just intensifies things. Now we also have transiting Pluto conjunct the natal moon. This can represent the people, the public, the moon, taking power at this moment and being very rebellious. And with transiting Pluto also strongly opposite Mercury, uh, there is a lot of vocal rhetoric and rebellion going on at this particular time. And of course, that is what we saw on the news. Now, additionally, the transiting lunar nodal axis is conjunct natal Mars very strongly. Again, the lunar nodal axis always intensifies things. And what's being intensified are feelings of anger and aggression among the people. Now, in the natal chart, whether it's July 2nd or July 4th, you have Mars square Neptune. And this is what is behind a lot of delusional thinking and misinformation in this country, in America. So if you combine those things with the transit, well, misinformation is getting people really stirred up at this time. And that leads to this revolutionary rebellion represented by the actions of Uranus and Pluto here. So, January 6th was somewhat of a perfect storm for America and not a good one. Okay, 2020, I think of that as the year of the pandemic. 2021 is the year of the insurrection. And 2022 is the year of war when Russia invaded Ukraine on February 24th, 2022. And I just put this chart out here for anyone who wants to reference it later on their own. But if we look to see what the transits were for Putin on this day, it's interesting that he had Uranus in opposition to his first house Venus, and Uranus was also making a sesquiquadrate to his natal Mars. And remember, Uranus, it's sort of a planet of manic depressiveness, bipolar disorder, if you will. It breaks up the existing pattern, it makes things very hyper, very excited. At best, this would be a very creative time for Putin. But as it turns out, with Venus in the first house, Venus represents not only the pleasure principle, the things we enjoy, but the values that we develop based upon what we like and what we don't like. Venus has a lot to do with our right nonverbal brain. So, in a nutshell, Putin is not thinking logically with his left brain. He's making decisions based upon his feelings, and he's feeling rather irritated as a result of transing Uranus making the sesquiquadrate to his natal Mercury. So he's a little unstable at this point. He's feeling very militaristic, and of course, he invades Ukraine. Now, we also have in this chart transing Venus and Mars, making a square to natal Mercury and Neptune. And Mercury conjunct Neptune, this can represent misinformation or delusions in Putin's own mind. And with the square from Venus and Mars, those delusions and misinformation are being stirred up on the day of the invasion of Ukraine. And of course, I can hardly think of anything more delusional than Putin asserting that Ukraine's Jewish president is in reality a Nazi. That just sounds absurd. But Putin lies to the public and he lies to himself, I believe. All of this leads to an excited state and a fair amount of delusion on his part. Okay, if we look at the transits for Ukraine on the day that it was invaded by Russia, notice how strongly transiting Chiron is squaring natal Uranus in the first house. It's also making a pretty strong square to the ascendant. Chiron, at its best, it's this drive to transcend the visible world, to move beyond what we can see into the spiritual world, and to experience this very transcendent joy and oneness with all things. Unfortunately, most people aren't ready for that, and so what they experience instead is some wounding. As I often say, you can't make a cosmic omelet without cracking a few cosmic eggs, and Chiron often has to crack our hard Saturnian shell before we can experience the good, sweet side of Chiron. And when it comes to nations and Chiron, most of the time what you get is wounding. Individuals, some will respond at a higher level to Chiron, but nations, it's a pretty good bet that when you see a square like this, you're going to get some wounding. Okay, so the Ukraine was certainly severely wounded on February 24th of 2022 when Russia invaded, and that's shown quite clearly in this biwheel by the very, very strong square of transiting Chiron to natal Uranus. This promises something sudden, Uranus, and something wounding, uh, Chiron. And Chiron is in Aries, and Aries can be very militaristic. Now, to add some fuel to fire, the transiting lunar nodal axis was making a pretty strong square to Mercury and Jupiter in Ukraine's eighth house, which has to do with death and transformation. And over the past few years, Ukraine has sadly experienced a lot of death and a lot of transformation. But the lunar nodal axis always intensifies things, and that future for Ukraine has certainly been intensified. Okay. Also, in 2022, America went through three Pluto returns. The first one occurred on February 22nd, uh, just 2 days before Russia invaded Ukraine. And in addition to these three Pluto returns in fall of 2023, throughout most of the fall, we had a very near conjunction of transiting Pluto with natal Pluto. It never became exact, but it was extremely close. So it's pretty much like having Pluto returns throughout this whole 2 year period. And whenever a country experiences a Pluto return, it tends to either undergo a death or a transformation. Some countries cease to exist after Pluto returns, or they lose a lot of power and become rather irrelevant. Other countries will undergo radical transformations as a result of a Pluto return. Now, for America, it seems like these days our democracy is just hanging by a thread. So it's certainly a time of change and transformation for America. The country is very divided. It hasn't been this divided since the American Civil War in the 1860s, and we still don't know what the final outcome will be. That chapter has yet to be written. Okay, there were some other momentous events in 2023. For instance, this was when Pluto entered Aquarius. It last was in Aquarius in the latter part of the 1700s, and its sojourn through Aquarius coincided with both the American Revolution and the French Revolution. And whenever you have Pluto moving from Capricorn into Aquarius, uh, you get that transfer of power from individuals to the people. Now, oftentimes that's a good thing, but sometimes it can be a bad thing. You can have uh, good rulers and bad rulers when you look at power being invested in a single person. And you can have both good or bad results when power is invested in people instead of individuals. Uh, People can lead the way for things like democracy, or people can just resort to mob rule, such as what happened during the French Revolution during that period that is known as the Reign of Terror, when a lot of people were needlessly killed. Okay, now some of the other things we expect from Pluto and Aquarius are for technology to grow by leaps and bounds. And two things we've already seen are one, the prospect of commercial nuclear fusion that is on the horizon. Within a decade, we might be getting unlimited amounts of energy from nuclear fusion. Uh, and another thing that we've seen appear and has really, really grown dramatically since Pluto entered Aquarius is artificial intelligence. It has been growing faster than our ability to properly control and regulate it. And there are concerns about what might happen in the future as a result of artificial intelligence. We also expect to see, in addition to the power shifts to groups or people, we expect to see more humanitarian concerns uh, with Pluto and Aquarius. So there are some good things that will happen. And Pluto is going to be in Aquarius for about this 20-year period from 2023 until 2043. And then in early 2044, it moves into Pisces for a long period of time. Now, at the beginning of every period, you get some moving back and forth through retrograde motion from the new sign back into the old sign. So there were periods where Pluto has briefly gone back into Capricorn. And later on, there are going to be some periods where Pluto kind of moves from Aquarius into Pisces and then back into Aquarius before it gets firmly established in Pisces again. But this event of Pluto and Aquarius, it's covers roughly about 20 years, and we should see tremendous uh, advances in technology during this period, as well as tremendous shifts in power from individuals to groups and to the people. Let's see. On March 11th of 2023, there was a conjunction of Jupiter with Chiron. And I think I've mentioned already, perhaps, that most astrologers tend to associate Chiron with wounding. And they call it the wounded healer after mythology, the Greek myths about the centaur Chiron who received a wound that never fully healed. However, when Jupiter comes into conjunction with Chiron, we always get something very sweet and very enduring that represents also the characteristics of the sign that the conjunction occurred in. And I've talked in past videos about all the various Jupiter-Chiron conjunctions for the 20th century and various signs and what happened afterwards. I'm not going to take the time to go over all of that right now, but I will say that with this conjunction happening in Aries, we expect something transcendent to happen, which will also involve what we might call spiritual warriors. And the last time this conjunction occurred in Aries was in 1976 in March. And that was the month that they began production on the movie Star Wars. And in Star Wars, you had this new religion, uh, the religion of the Force. And it was very individualistic. Some people could connect with the Force, others couldn't. And the spiritual warriors associated with the Force were the Jedi Knights. Okay, so I was expecting something along those lines to emerge from this conjunction. I should point out that sometimes it can take months or even several years before you become aware of what it was that this conjunction brought forth. Well, in this case, it was the very next day, on March 12th, 2023, that the Oscar ceremony was held, and the movie Everything Everywhere All at Once swept the Oscars, and along with other awards it's won, I think it's now the most award-winning movie of all time. And Michelle Kwan, who received the Oscar for Best Actress, she was certainly a spiritual warrior in that film. But the new paradigm that emerged from that film, or that was popularized by that film, was the notion that we live in a multiverse. There's not just one single universe, but that every decision we make, every possible decision we could make, results in a new universe. And in some of those universes, we have solved the problems that we are currently faced with. And in this movie, it was shown how you can essentially travel, let's say travel with your mind from one universe to another. You can connect with that universe where you have solved your current problem, and then you can apply that solution to your universe in order to make things better. So this is a radical new idea, and over the years to come, I am anticipating and hopeful that scientists will find more evidence that we live in a multiverse instead of just a single universe, and that they will discover ways in which we can use uh, the multiverse to help us improve the particular universe that we're in now. Okay, so that is what I think is on the horizon. Also, I found out recently, uh, I was watching this new sci-fi series on Apple Plus TV. I think it's called Dark Matter. It's based on a sci-fi novel by, I believe, Blake Crouch. And this novel is also all about the multiverse. Uh, the scientist learns how to travel to different parts of the multiverse, to different universes, and he is essentially traveling from one universe to another to find one that he prefers. But within those other universes, he often finds copies of himself. And this is where things turn dark. He has to get rid of the version of him that is already in that particular universe so that he can stay there and enjoy the good things he's discovered in that particular version. So, either way, uh, we have two things involving the multiverse that began in March of 2023. So that looks like it's going to be an important concept that's here to stay. It could affect people's worldview on a personal level and on a scientific level. There may be more research done on the concept of a multiverse, and we may find more and more evidence that shows that we do indeed live in a multiverse instead of a single universe. Okay, on April 12th of 2022, we had a Jupiter-Neptune conjunction in Pisces. And there were some wonderful things that I think some astrologers speculated might happen. More compassion for others that could have taken place. People having more dreams and visions that will later be realized as these planets perhaps move on into Aries. But there were also some bad things or some dark things that happened. And I want to point out that this conjunction occurred during a time of what Vedic astrologers call Kalasarpa Yoga. And what that means is that all of the planets, except for the moon, which moves around a lot every month, but all of these other planets were sort of bunched up on one side of the lunar nodal axis. And just like in the Barbo Planetary Cycle Index, when these outer planets get too close together, having all of these planets on one side of the lunar nodal axis, that also creates a great imbalance. It inhibits the flow of planets into other areas of the zodiac. So people feel very confined and like they feel like energy is not flowing the way it should. And that is exactly how I felt during this period from the beginning of the war in Ukraine until sometime in April, when I believe this condition Kalasarpa Yoga, it not long after this, I think it vanished as soon as in about a month, the sun will move past this north node of the moon, and Kalasarpa Yoga will be broken and energy will gradually start to flow better. But I remember how dark things felt at this time, how there was just an utter lack of joy. I could not sense others around the world at this time. Usually we have kind of an invisible connection between us and our friends and our loved ones where we pick up on things happening with them, but I really could not connect with others during this period. It was very, very dark, very colorless. Reality seemed to be in shades of gray rather than a rainbow of colors. So this was a dark time. And let's see, one of the more unfortunate things that happened as a result of this Jupiter-Neptune conjunction in Pisces, in which some astrologers had anticipated, was inflation worldwide was suddenly out of control. In America, inflation for the year 2022 was over 8%. In the following year, 2023, it came down quite a bit, but prices still remain high. And a lot of prices for things are still high. And that is an unfortunate consequence of this conjunction of Jupiter and Neptune in Pisces, and having occurred at an unfortunate time when the Barbo planetary cycle was still pretty much at a low. It had just passed its absolute low for the century. And at the time of Kalasarpa Yoga, that perhaps made some of the negative consequences a little bit more likely. Now, something else which has happened since this conjunction is renewed interest and research into mind-altering psychedelic drugs. Right now, it looks like marijuana is going to, before the end of 2024, will be rescheduled in America uh, from a number 1 controlled substance, which puts it in the same category as heroin and fentanyl, to a class 3 controlled substance, which means that doctors around the country will be able to prescribe it for medical conditions. Additionally, I read about research and legalization for medical purposes in states around America of other psychedelic drugs like with names like ecstasy and magic mushrooms and ketamine. So this has also brought about a renewed interest in the use of psychedelics for therapy, different kinds of therapeutic applications, and that seems to be going forward. And inflation is being tamed, and hopefully we'll see prices coming down more in the future, hopefully the near future. Okay, that is going to be the end of part 1. So let me stop sharing here. Okay, and I'm back. So I hope you enjoyed part 1. In part 2, we get into 2023, the Israel-Hamas war, and we also move on into uh, the April 8th, 2024 solar eclipse, and some of the very momentous wounding that has occurred as a result of Sun, Moon, and Chiron all being exactly conjunct to the minute at the time of that eclipse. So I hope you enjoyed this. I hope you join me for part 2. And for now, I'll just say so long and be well.